classic storm scenario.
I take it you're not showing me this in order to demonstrate the awesome power of nature, Brian.
They kill Les Darcy and they poison Farlex, so you be careful.
And here's the single that wins the match for Australia. He's out!
Now that's one marvellous way to make compost, and it works beautifully.
This is truly, truly heavenly.
So, come on.
Today, the whole world is talking about war. All hearts are burdened, all lives are saddened by thoughts of this greatest of crimes against humanity. Everywhere you will hear people say we are back in the days of 1914. But the great masses of people of all nations who experience the misery of war will never again be war-minded in the 1914 way. Nobody is under any illusions about the glory of war today.
Australians, like others, believed that the First World War was the end of all war. But just 21 years later, the shadow of global conflict again darkened our lives. Once again, Australians crossed the world to do battle. Once again, they fought and died for a cause they believed in. But what began as a battle for the empire became a struggle for our own survival, a coming of age, and a test of the national character. This time, though, their Anzac fathers had told them what to expect.
He was a gentle person and a very loving father. So he didn't want me to go through what he went through, and he said, "You're a bloody fool." I said, "Dad, I've got to go, you know, got to go and help the empire."
In the 1930s, no young Australian could ignore the aftershocks of the Great War. Reminders of sacrifice had a hallowed place in households in every street.
I had a number of uncles and close people who came back and talked about it. And they told, you know, the nitty-gritty of machine guns and the mud and all the rest of it. So I had a pretty clear picture that it wasn't all nice.
The men who would go to the next war grew up with stories from the last one.
one of the chaps that worked for us on the station, he was a returned bloke from the First World War. But always said to me, Dean, if there's ever another war, never join the bloody infantry, he said. And what did I do? I joined the infantry.
The next generation of soldiers had their values and characters shaped by the Great Depression of the 1930s. Like Australians before them, they learned the value of resilience and initiative.
My recollection of youth is of social relationships, of everyone getting along together and no one having very much. We could do a lot with very little. We made our own pleasures, and we didn't expect these other things. We weren't particularly discontented.
Through the depression and hardship, Australians clung to a belief in a lasting peace. So defence had been allowed to run down. A vast land with just 7 million people could not defend itself. Like our Navy and Army, the Air Force was primitive. Its newest fighter aircraft was already obsolete. Meanwhile, Germany and Japan rearmed. War was clearly possible. Japan's expansion had our leaders deeply worried. But in September 1939, it was Germany's military aggression that pulled Australia into war.
It is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war. No harder task can fall to the lot of a democratic...
I was out visiting some friends in the country, sitting in front of a nice big fire, and the owner of the property, he was an ex-serviceman. I can't remember how many others of us. And we just looked at one another and said, okay, we must do something. Let's join up.
Australians committed themselves to the defence of the Empire against Nazi Germany. It was 38 years since Federation, yet there was still no real conflict between being British and being Australian. It wasn't seen as someone else's war.
It was good, really, that way. Your loyalties, Australia didn't really matter that much. It was the loyalty to England was the thing.
Up to you and up to me to rid the world of insanity and make it safe for humanity.
Australians could not be compelled to fight overseas. So volunteers were called for the 2nd AIF, successors to the Anzacs. But slow enlistment brought on propaganda.
We're going to give him the Razzie, 'cause he's a nasty Nazi.
Now it's up to you and me.
And I didn't really, to be perfectly honest, consider I was making a great sacrifice. I was just doing the normal thing, if you like to say doing the duty, but it never occurred to anybody round about me that it wasn't the thing to do.
And they came round and said, who wants to join the AIF? And I was half asleep. I said, oh, yeah, I'll be in that. What is it? So from there on, I was sunk.
Once again, thousands of Australians volunteered for service half a world away. Yet again, our forces were placed at Britain's disposal. The RAAF's 10 Squadron, already training in Britain, went straight into action against the Germans. the Royal Australian Navy was immediately placed under Royal Naval Command. 5 destroyers and a cruiser joined the British fleet in the Mediterranean. Aboard HMAS Perth, the new recruits were settling in.
They were really children. They were only 18, 19, and with very young faces now. Almost everyone in that picture was killed later on.
The government wanted 20,000 army volunteers. It took 3 months to get the numbers. Some just needed a job. Most thought the war was morally right, and all saw the chance of adventure. From these men came a new generation of that unique character, the Australian soldier. Men like Dick Tanner, who was sent to Paul Cullen's company.
And he came up to me, he was about 6'3", he was a drover. And he said, "You my new boss?" I said, "That's right." He said, "Can you lend me £1?" I said, "What do you want for?" He said, "Well, a lot of the fellas, or you'd have said a lot of the blokes, are going AWL. I don't know what it is, but I want to go with them. I need £1." I said, "Here's the £1." Well, you couldn't get a more dinky-die Australian than Sapper Tanner, the drover from Wallabadar. Australians from all walks of life were translated into first-class soldiers.
We had to join, we had to join, we had to join, we had to join, we had to join Bob Menzies' army. £2 a week, fuck all the eat, big leather boots and ballistas on your feet. We had to join, we had to join, we had to join.
I was only 16 then, but I did watch that with my mother. She used to take me into Sydney to do that. I think it affected her probably more than I, because she realised what war was. Having lost a brother in the First World War, she thought, oh, here we go again.
4 months after the declaration of war, the troops embarked. It was the first of many such convoys. And as each one left, the hard reality suddenly became clearer.
There were women on the other side of Sydney Cove, standing there dumbly in the drifts of rain, clinging to the wet iron and staring through the railings with hungry intentness. They made no effort to wave. Their faces, white and strained and tiny in the distance, hardly moved. All through the morning I noticed them and was aware of their tiny hands gripping the iron, and the rain over their knuckles, and running over their wedding rings.
I never left Sydney. Hadn't been outside of the metropolitan area of Sydney until I joined the army.
As they had in 1914, young Australians willingly crossed the world to another war. Most went to the Middle East to protect Empire interests. Their desert training began in Palestine. Like their fathers before them, they were raw and spirited and had to be transformed into professional soldiers.
But you've got to be healthy. You've got to be courageous. And that means a tinge of recklessness. That's the infantry have got a fixed bonus and charge, recklessly, often to their death.
Changing these civilians into soldiers would take a lot of time. time that would create powerful bonds. The mateship, that in the end mattered more than anything else.
The friendships you forged, and we could talk to one another so openly. It was amazing, really. You had bonded such a friendship. It was unbelievable. We were more than brothers. That was the point of it all.
As the Australians trained, the Empire was facing disaster. France fell and Dunkirk was evacuated. Italy joined the war on the side of Germany, and London was pounded from the sky. "30 Australian pilots fought in the Battle of Britain. And in the Mediterranean, HMAS Sydney played a major role in sinking the Italian cruiser Bartolomeo Colleoni. Back home, the Sydney's crew were greeted as heroes. The mood in Australia changed, with unprecedented numbers enlisting. Then in January 1941, the untried young men of the 2nd AIF finally entered into battle. The Italians planned to dominate northern Africa and were threatening Egypt and the Suez Canal. The new Anzacs confronted them in Libya, a country many of the Australians had never known existed. They went to war near a town called Bardia.
We got issued with an issue of rum, a little nip. I mean, it wouldn't even curdle your hair sort of thing, and away you went. And you're too busy looking for this and that to worry about yourself.
You take for granted there'll be casualties. And you just hope, secretly, that it won't be yourself.
The Italians thought we had armour plating on, and because they were firing at us and none of us were going over. I don't think they had the determination in them, because it was only a desert. And who wants the darn desert? I mean, they couldn't see any point in that.
Though greatly outnumbered, the Empire forces captured Bardia within 2 days. 40,000 Italian prisoners were taken. The men of Bardia proved that they were worthy successors to the Anzacs, with the same self-mocking spirit.
One of my very best friends, Geoffrey Cox, was a lieutenant then, and during the attack on Bardia, a bullet pierced the cheeks of his bottom. So as he was hobbling out, someone said, "You're a lucky fellow, you got 5 arseholes."
The Italians were driven back across Libya in a series of hard-fought battles. Tobruk, Derna, and Benghazi were taken. Morale soared with each victory.
Darling, I hope you were not among the mob that raided Bardia the other day. I have worried since, as we were told 60 failed to return. Every minute of every day and night, you are in my mind. One says, thank God as each day passes, for each day gone is one nearer to your return, for which I pray day and night.
Australian women were again learning to live without their men. But many women now had opportunities previously denied them. The resources of the country were diverted to the war effort. Even so, other aspects of life went on much as before.
Going to work every day, working in a theatre, with your usherette and you monitor the sound and you take people to their seats and all that. Going out at night time, dancing and all that. I was sort of a very happy person and I didn't think a lot about the war.
And today, 12,000 miles from London, 10,000 miles from Washington, and but 3,000 miles from Tokyo, many Australians fear that 1941 has been chosen by militarist Japan as its year of opportunity.
There was a fear of Japan. We felt that the yellow hordes would overrun us eventually. There was always that fear. We didn't have a lot of Asians here. There were very few Chinese in Little Bourke Street, a few Chinese up at Ballarat, but we didn't mix with them. So we didn't really know very much about the outside world. We were a community of ourselves. We loved being Australians. We knew we were part of the British Empire, so we knew that if anything happened, the British Empire would come to our rescue, and we felt that.
Australians had always assumed that the British presence in Singapore would protect them. But by 1940, British eyes were firmly fixed on Hitler. The Australian government agreed to send a contingent of troops to Singapore to bolster the British garrison.
When we landed in Singapore and there was nothing doing there, we thought, well, what do we send you here? We're on a holiday. Some of the commentators in the press, they didn't call us glamour boys, but they used to be very caustic about the troops in Malaya, the wonderful time they were having while their brothers were fighting in the Middle East.
The remoteness of Australia allowed life to continue as ever. But that distance had its disadvantages. We were playing a minor role in determining where our troops would fight. The war was being run from Britain. So in 1941, our Prime Minister journeyed to London.
I want to tell them on behalf of Australia, and I believe I can say it as a self-appointed ambassador for every British Dominion, that they are not alone against the world.
Churchill told Menzies our troops were now needed to fight the Germans in Greece. Menzies agreed, but he was not told by the British that Blamey, our senior general, had strong misgivings. The Australians were sent on what their own commander knew was a lost cause. Along with the troops went a contingent of Australian nurses.
So we sailed to the tune of Gracie Fields singing Wish Me Luck as you wave me goodbye. The whole convoy sailed off to Greece.
When we were going ashore in Port Pireus, the English sailors said to us, "We'll be back in 6 weeks to pick you up." That's how confident they were. That's how much they knew over us. We didn't know a darn thing.
Greece was the Empire's last surviving ally on the continent. Churchill had promised to defend the Greeks against Nazi aggression. It was a noble cause, but a catastrophic misjudgment. Australian, New Zealand and British soldiers were sent in to face an overwhelming German force. A brutal onslaught of over 200,000 troops.
The big difference between them and us was the fact that they had equipment. They had all the support in the world. Whereas we had our pea shooters, because it's a bit hard to fight tanks and Stuka dive bombers with pea shooters.
It was a sight to see. On the opposite bank, the German regiment. There they were in extended line after line after line, walking down to that ford, wading in, mowing down, but gradually, as you do in war, they gained a position.
We could hear the guns at night, and the Germans flew so low over the trees that we could see them as they were flying over, because they had to go past us to go around to get to the airstrip, and blew up any planes that were there, so we had no air force.
In the air, the Germans were devastating, leaving the men on the ground defenseless. Just 8 days after the first German attack, the order came to withdraw.
We whinged and cried and, blew hell out of the English government for it, and we blamed the Germans for it. We blamed everybody but ourselves. But we never chucked the towel in. That's the main thing. You never say die.
One lass said, well, if you're taken a prisoner of war, she said, let your hair down. Make yourself look as ugly as you can, and any of you girls with dentures, take them out. Make yourselves as plain and ugly as you can.
It was just a defeat which we knew we were defeated by overwhelming odds, and we did pretty well as an army against the Germans, but with no chance.
When the full story of these 2 or 3 weeks is written, the courage and endurance of the men who fought the rearguard action will amaze everyone. They fought by day and withdrew by night. For days they had little or no sleep. They were either fighting or moving all the time. Practically everyone had a bandage somewhere. Every one of them had a smile. Not even the Germans could remove that.
With the Allied fleet steaming to the rescue, the exhausted troops continued their fighting withdrawal to the beaches. Churchill's Greek campaign was a debacle.
We just sat on the beach until the early hours of the morning, and the next thing we knew, there was an English naval officer. He did say his name, I'm so-and-so, and I am in charge. It's a funny thing how his voice sounded. It's just straightened us all up. It was, thank God someone's in charge, sort of thing.
As the troops came aboard, the Allied ships endured constant German bombings. In the thick of it all was HMAS Perth.
We had scrambling nets down over the side, and they were in a bad way, a lot of them, and their attitude was just they were glad to be alive, and they were glad we were there.
It was all dark excepting for burning ships in the harbour. We had to get over the rails and whatever they have, carrying what you had, what you could have salvaged. And I heard a voice say, "Give me your hand, mate." And I said, "Oh, I'm all right, thank you." And they didn't know, these men didn't know they were getting women. They had no idea. He said, "Struth, be women." were really taken back. But they were marvellous boys. They rescued us and talked and talked and talked all night. They were just so happy to find somebody speaking the same language. Australians to talk to, Australian women. It was wonderful. There was a real camaraderie there, I can tell you.
The Germans' relentless advance continued into Crete, where many of the Australian troops had been evacuated. Ill-equipped and exhausted, they went back into battle. They fought doggedly, but were overwhelmed in under a fortnight. One division was now crippled, and 5,000 Australians had been taken prisoner. Later, the Perth returned to Sydney for repairs and found a complacent and unaware country.
We'd just come back from seeing all this bombing. You know, in Greece we were in Piraeus and we saw them bombed out, civilians and everything. And we saw the whole real business. We got back to Australia and I could get night leave, you see, and go out. We had to be back on board at 8 o'clock in the morning and hop in the tram coming back. And here were all the civilians. They'd open their papers and read it. Quick glance at the headlines, right over to the back page to study the racing. Didn't have a clue. And it was then we used to say, well, you know, there should be a bombing of Sydney to wake these blokes up.
Early in 1941, Hitler determined to rescue the Italians in North Africa. He sent General Rommel and his celebrated Afrika Korps into Libya. Confronting them were fresh Australian troops.
The first few Germans that I struck, they were pretty tough and they were good fighters. I was surprised how young they were. I know I was young. I don't suppose I thought about that, but they didn't seem much more than boys, you know.
These Australians would now have their first experience of combat. They had limited training and equipment, and the Germans pushed them and the Empire troops back to the port of Tobruk.
I had the idea that there was going to be risk, but the risk was offset by the excitement and enjoyment and the masculine maleness of the thing.
I'd never seen a dead person before I was in the army, and pretty hard actually for a start, but I've told a lot of people that my way of dealing with it was just to turn your brain off. Just turn your brain off when you're in those battles and people are getting shot and blown up and killed, and other people are, you know, breaking down and all this sort of thing that goes in action.
They fought with their backs to the sea and were told there'd be no surrender or retreat. Tobruk had to be held to stall the German advance on Egypt. Cut off by land, Tobruk could only be supplied from the sea. 9 aging Australian warships, known as the Scrap Iron Flotilla, became an inspiring lifeline. 2 ships were lost as they repeatedly ran the gauntlet of German bombs.
In the front line, of course, you didn't get practically no sleep because you got shelled and mortared every day and all day. You went weeks and weeks without a bath, weeks and weeks without changing your clothes. If you slept at all, you'd probably sleep in the daytime, and because there was millions of flies and millions of fleas in those trenches.
The Germans were used to swift victories. But time and again, their attacks on the impudent Australians were repulsed. They derisively called them the Rats of Tobruk. It was adopted as a badge of honour.
The Germans were good fighters. They were rather like Australians, I suppose. We respected them, and I think they respected us, although they called us rats. No, I don't think we hated them. Yet we shot them up. It's strange, isn't it?
I used to say, there's no comedians and there's no atheists in the front line.
On the front line, the rats would sleep by day and harass the enemy at night. For months on end, they lived in holes in the ground, on the edge of survival and breakdown.
Oh, they'd be like people with dementia. They're just wandering around, like lost and talking to themselves, and just complete nervous breakdown.
The important thing for every man when he's in a situation like that is that he doesn't let go, because he can't be looked upon by his mates as being a coward, so he has to pretend to be completely nonchalant about what's happening.
People blown to bits. Of course, people get shot. They only need to get one bullet and they're dead. They might stagger around a bit for a while, but usually they just drop like a stone. And often, people that you've become very friendly with. Yeah. And it all makes you pretty aggressive.
We had a couple of suicides. They were a pity, because they were too distraught. But less said about those, the better, I suppose.
Left ranging. 8-400. Fire.
For 6 months, the largely Australian force held out against an enemy twice its size. And for the first time, a determined German offensive was turned back. It was a shining moment for the Empire in the darkest days of the war. And the siege of Tobruk entered Australian folklore.
You poor fools. The world will know you as the Rats of Tobruk. You ignominious sons of sheep herders. You are just a mere handful, do you hear me? Just a mere handful. You're not enough.
Not enough. We are enough. We are enough to do our country loss. And if to live, the fewer men the greater share of honor. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when his day is named. We few. We happy few. We band of brothers.
As the Rats of Tobruk frustrated the Germans, Australians were also fighting in Syria and Lebanon. With Empire forces, they defeated the pro-Nazi Vichy French. The Australians did most of the fighting and sustained most of the casualties. Crucial to their success was support from the air. Day after day, RAAF Tomahawk fighters took to the skies, harassing the enemy and protecting Allied troops. Their perilous desert war would continue for more than 2 years.
Combat's a funny thing. There's not very much difference between cowardice and bravery.
And, you know, I think I wavered between the two, I suppose, and because underneath I was a coward, but sometimes in combat you forgot how cowardly you were and you got stuck in.
The freewheeling Australian airmen had been supporting our troops since the first battles with the Italians. They built an impressive record, constantly outperforming the enemy. But regular losses of men and aircraft were inevitable.
When you'd land back, you'd wait and count the airplanes as they came back to see who was missing. And someone probably come back 10 minutes later and you'd be probably given him up for dead, and there'd be a great feeling of relief when he'd land in. In our mess, we never had special seats for anyone, because if someone was missing, there wasn't a vacant place, because we used to move around in the mess.
By August 1941, the surviving Australians in Tobruk were in a desperate state. Six months of fighting had left them dangerously weakened.
Everybody in Tobruk, especially the frontline soldiers, they all suffered from malnutrition eventually. And we only used to get a pint of water a day, and sometimes you didn't get that.
I used to dream of a tap running. The idea of being able to turn a tap on and see water gush out, it was a fantasy.
This could not continue. The Australians had already sustained almost 4,000 casualties at Tobruk. Blamey, the Australian commander, asserted his independence. Against the wishes of the British, he demanded his troops be relieved. After the losses in Greece and Crete, the AIF needed to regroup. Battered but unbeaten, the now legendary Rats of Tobruk were withdrawn. But their achievements were soon overtaken by events back home. We had a new Prime Minister who took control during the gravest crisis in our history.
I put it to you as shortly as I can. Labour stands for Australia. Australia stands for and with the Empire. The Empire stands and fights for freedom and for liberty wherever liberty and freedom are in danger.
The threat was now coming dangerously close to home. Most of the sailors who'd been cheered as the heroes of the Mediterranean now became the victims of a German raider off Western Australia. HMAS Sydney was sunk with the loss of all on board, 645 men. Australians were shocked.
Perhaps we, like on board, didn't take it quite as seriously, because we'd seen so many ships sunk and that, well, this is just another ship. But of course it was the end of the world for a lot of people in Australia. How dare they sink an Australian ship, you know, and what terrible things. It's not like most people, you know, no tragedy's a tragedy till it affects them.
Australia was now exposed. Just how vulnerable we were became clear on the 7th of December 1941, when Japan entered the war.
To the women of Australia in this terrible emergency, in humble duty we say, be steadfast, and all will be well. Young in history, unblooded on our own soil, let us give to the world a saga from the south that the world will hear and marvel upon. to the heathen hordes who seek to dye the Pacific with blood, let us run our star-strewn flag to the masthead.
Oh, one Australian was worth 10 Japanese. We could handle 10 Japanese, no problem at all.
Well, we were told that the Japanese soldier was short-sighted. They had rifles, and this is a fact, that they had rifles that fired small bullets, and if you got a small bullet in, you could pull it out.
They didn't fight at night time. And little bow-legged blokes, we found it entirely different.
Our belief in the inferiority of the Japanese soldier was only exceeded by our faith in the British to protect us. In the coming weeks, both beliefs would be severely challenged. The defence of Australia had long depended on a British promise to protect the region with a major naval presence in Singapore. While the British were in Singapore, we could sleep at night.
We thought Singapore itself was a very strong base. It had big guns, it had naval guns, it had everything. And we thought all the British troops that were there, we thought nobody would ever take this place.
Australia's fate was naive. Stretched on several fronts, the British could only release 2 warships to Singapore, the Prince of Wales and Repulse. But 8 days after arriving, both ships were sunk off the east coast of Malaya. The Australian population was shaken to the core, and the British Empire in the Pacific was brought to its knees. Only the Australian, British and Indian troops in Malaya could now save Singapore. In the face of a dramatic Japanese advance, the British and Indian troops crumbled. The Australians were sent in to confront the invasion.
Strange enough, I was the foremost man, and there's a whole army, Japanese army, coming down the road to me, and I'm there. Not really. I was asleep when they come through, and my mate, he was he had all the grenades, and I was a mortar man, and he goes like that, and he points, and 8 feet away, there's 50 Japanese on push bikes riding down the road towards Singapore, and behind them another 50, and another 50, and another 50.
The overconfident Japanese were caught in a cleverly planned ambush. The road became a killing field.
I fired for 10 minutes, I suppose. And then I saw 4 other Japanese in the gutter. So I went in with the bayonet. So I got one bloke through the back. The strange thing about that too, these 4 Japanese screaming like pigs. Absolutely screaming. When one bloke's got me by the throttling me, on top of me, choking me. And the other bloke's leaning over with a bayonet and stabbing me.
Ray Brown survived with 22 bayonet wounds. The ambush was a resounding success. The wounded were evacuated and only 1 Australian was killed. It led to unjustified optimism as the next Australian battalions moved north.
It sounds ridiculous now, but I can remember blokes cheering as we went up in the wagons. And the next thing we know is all hell lets loose. There's machine guns firing, and there's bombs coming over, and there's snipers in the trees and everything else. And we suddenly thought, gee, we're in it. I reckon I dug the deepest slit trench in Malaya. I thought I could have gone through to England.
The Australians withstood the Japanese barrage and countered by destroying 10 tanks. But heavily outnumbered, They were soon surrounded. Malaya became a series of gallant stands, ending in fighting withdrawal.
We ran into our own artillery who were covering our retreat, and fellows got killed by our own artillery. And so the next move was into the swamps.
Wounded Australians were slaughtered by the Japanese. The frightened survivors reached Singapore and waited for the final assault.
And once they'd landed, well, they just kept coming. And there was no stopping them. And it went on for days. I think for 8 days, we virtually didn't sleep for 8 days. There was no sleep. Well, you couldn't sleep. On the Sunday night, there was suddenly quiet silence. We didn't know what had happened. And then somebody came around and said, it's all over. All I can remember is laying down, and I woke up the next morning. And when we woke up, we thought, well, this is the finish. We'll be all, they'll kill a lot of us.
We were absolutely horrified. Most of the men just broke their rifles and lay down and cried, you know. And they just want to fight. I mean, I suppose it's, well, we were taught to fight. You know? That's all it was about. We knew we could beat them. Well, we thought we could.
The surrender was a black day. The imperial insurance policy had failed, and Australians felt betrayed. 15,000 Australians fell into Japanese hands and were marched into Changi prison camp. All the time, the Japanese moved closer to Australia. Our troops in Rabaul, Ambon and Timor fought valiantly, but were defeated. And on the 28th of February 1942, HMAS Perth sailed into a Japanese invasion fleet off Java.
I was down in the lowest steering position. My job was chief quartermaster and I was steering the ship. And just through the bulkhead was where this torpedo hit, in the magazine. And I heard the captain say, that's torn it. And then from then on we were just consistently being blown to pieces. We were in tropics and blokes were in white gear, and when I got into the sick bay flat, which is just outside the sick bay, there were a lot of bodies there, all in white, but all well and truly bloodstained, so that what you got was a picture of red and white. On occasions, they decorate the quarter deck with signal flags. And when I looked at these blokes, the thought occurred to me, it's the last of the celebration, you know, there they are. Just like after the dance, we pull down the flags.
"353 men were lost. In the blackness of this terrible night, as the survivors struggled for air, the future for Australia seemed grim indeed.
And then a couple of Japanese destroyers came in and they'd stopped their engines and drifted amongst us. And there were these chaps on board all in beautiful white suits, you know, and here were we in the water looking up, you know, like mendicants, beggars and so forth. We had one bloke and he screamed out, help, help, save me, and all the rest of it. And I said, shut up, you bastard, you know. And then a clear voice came from the bridge of this destroyer. And he said, we good boys now, eh, Ozzy? Just like that.
On the 19th of February 1942, Victor Tuckerman stood on the deck of HMAS Warrnambool in Darwin Harbour. The war was something that was happening to someone somewhere else. At 10 a.m., 188 Japanese aircraft came out of the steamy summer sky. Breaking naval regulations, Victor Tuckerman filmed the first foreign attack on our soil. In the panic that followed, many Australians began to wonder whether this was the beginning of the end. At the start of 1942, the outlook was grim for Australia. The Japanese were closing in, but our forces were still scattered across the world. Most of the troops still in Australia were home defence militiamen, many of them conscripts. From their untrained ranks came the men who would be sent north to Papua, the men who would defend us.
We were lined up, and the officer stood up there and he said, we're calling for volunteers for 39th Battalion. We'd be pure and simply a garrison force, so when you do come, bring your tennis rackets, your sand shoes, all your sporting gear. It's beautiful Polynesian girls dancing on the beaches, and the picture he painted was just unbelievable.
From the start of the war, the Australian Army had been split in two. The men of the AIF had volunteered to serve abroad, but the militia were labelled koalas, not to be shot at or exported.
Chocolate soldiers. We weren't fair dinkum soldiers. We hadn't volunteered to go overseas. We didn't like being called chocos. I think we proved ourselves.
Most of our experienced troops were still in the Middle East, where they'd been fighting under British command.
Well, there was nothing we could do about it. We hoped that nothing would happen that would cause Australia to be attacked before we got there, so to speak. And we hoped that everything was all right at home.
Australia now faced an agonising choice about where to concentrate its forces. In February 1942, our Prime Minister, John Curtin, ordered most of our troops home. But a force of local militiamen had already left for Papua.
We had to leave that night, and we were told very quickly that you can forget about the tennis rackets and the sand shoes. If need be, they'll be issued to you.
Under Australian law, the militia could only fight in Australia. Conveniently for the government, Papua was an Australian territory. Port Moresby was the last defence before the Australian mainland. Arriving to hold it was some of the most poorly trained and badly equipped forces in the Australian Army.
We literally speaking had nothing. We had the old .303 rifle and a Lewis gun, which was very, very antiquated. But our time in Port Moresby was very frightening, of course it was, because the Japs came over and bombed us day and night.
Clearly, Australia could not defend itself alone. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had dragged the Americans into the war. After defeat in the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Australia to take command. Australia again accepted a subservient role. But we soon had reason to be grateful for the Americans. For 3 days, the American fleet confronted the Japanese in the Coral Sea. Supported by HMAS Australia and Hobart, they forced the Japanese to abandon their seaborne invasion of Port Moresby. Back in Sydney, one member of the Australia's crew had overstayed his shore leave and missed the ship's departure.
I walked into the police office on Garden Island and I said, Leading Stoker Williams reporting for duty, sir. He said, he said, we've been waiting for you. I said, thanks very much. He said, your bag and hammock's on the cutter bull. He said, go down and see you in the morning, sir.
As Bill Williams settled down to sleep on the cutter bull, 3 Japanese midget submarines slipped into Sydney Harbour. It was the wake-up call that everyone had feared.
I don't know whether I was asleep or just going to sleep, but I heard the commotion, the bang and everything. And I got out of bed and started praying on the floor, and that's the only time in my life I've ever done that. Got up, knelt down on the floor and prayed because I thought, the Japanese are here.
Next thing I knew, I was in Sydney Hospital. I never heard any explosion or anything.
A torpedo meant for the USS Chicago struck the converted ferry, the Cuttable. 21 sailors were killed. It was one of 97 direct attacks on Australia during the war. The popular fear of invasion intensified, with the country already on a full war footing.
Every human being in this country is now, whether he or she likes it, at the service of the government to work in the defence of Australia.
In July 1942, the Japanese reached the northern coastline of Papua. They planned an audacious overland assault on Port Moresby. Across the wild and precipitous Owen Stanley Mountains, Australia's militiamen were on their way north to meet them. They had little idea of the horror that lay ahead.
It was exciting. You had a feeling that you were at last going into battle. And when we left Port Moresby and started walking out, we didn't go very far before we got so hot.
Oh, it was murderous. It was that hard. You see, that was our worst enemy, the terrain.
It's still dark and frightening. It's a weird feeling.
It was one of the epic journeys of our military history. For 8 long days, the militiamen climbed through appalling conditions.
You perspired all day, and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it would rain. So you were continually wet.
And it was cold at night. It was so cold at night and boiling hot in the daytime.
The militiamen had to reach the village of Kokoda and its airstrip before the Japanese. Ill-prepared and poorly led, some would crack and run from the enemy. But most would find the courage that would place the name Kokoda into Australian history.
When the kids are going into battle tomorrow in dawn, you had to think of something to talk about. There was one subject that got the lot every time, that was sex. You started talking about shielders and there they were.
Our officer, before going into the actual battle, he said, "Now, I don't want anybody shirking on this attack." And he stood at the back of us waving a .45 revolver around, which we didn't appreciate because none of us had any thought of shirking it.
Some prayed, some swore. With fear. But you couldn't show it in front of your mates, could you? You couldn't show it.
It was a war of nerves with an invisible enemy. The Japanese approached with cunning and stealth, rarely seen until it was too late.
One of my boys got shot fair between the eyes, right alongside me. It was a perfect shot. Buggers. They used to attack us by screaming out. It's terrible to be afraid. brave ones have prayed and still keep going. That's what they did, you know. Scared, bloody stiff, and still kept going. They were so young. They were so young. I loved them all.
The militiamen fought desperately, but couldn't hold Kokoda. Outnumbered 10 to 1, they retreated through the jungle in a courageous and exhausting fighting withdrawal. Their only hope was to stall the Japanese long enough for relief to arrive.
In the hearts and minds of thousands of Australian women today is just one thought. The boy is home again. For the nation, there is the satisfaction in knowing that some of its best fighting men are back to join the ranks that now buttress Australia against Japanese aggression. They have new lines on their faces to make a mother's heart ache, but they've also new steel in their hearts.
The Middle East veterans went straight into jungle training. This time, the stakes were much higher.
We thought we had a real job to do this time. It was for us that we were fighting, for us, Australia and Australians. And there was a real sense of not letting people down this time round. It was fair dinkum.
At last, reinforcements were on their way to Papua. And it was just in time. The Japanese landed at Milne Bay, where they met fierce resistance from a combined force of Australian soldiers and airmen. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Japanese land invasion was turned back. This left the Kokoda Trail as Japan's last hope of reaching Port Moresby. There, on the edge of the jungle, the AIF reinforcements prepared for the battle to defend Australia. Up on the ridges, the exhausted militiamen had been fighting for a month. They were near collapse when their compatriots arrived.
Oh, they looked like gods from the heavens. It was so good to see them. They'd been in training in Queensland. They'd come from the Middle East. They were brown, and they had a spring in their step. And they were going to show those little yellow bastards.
The Australians were alone and confronting a determined enemy.
They had a complete disregard of the loss of life. And so it was just a question of really mowing them down, trying killing them as quickly as they replaced it and put in another attack.
The militiamen and the AIF held the Japanese at bay for 4 crucial days. There was no more talk of chocolate soldiers.
They were gallant soldiers, they were good Australians. The word choco didn't enter our vocabulary at all.
But the combined force was still outgunned and outnumbered. There was scarcely time to bury the dead.
You can't do anything, you can't take time out. Think about it. Things are happening so quickly. Deaths are occurring all around you. If you stopped, you'd lose. People know this. That's what war is, unfortunately.
Late one afternoon, as the rain and mist closed in, a young Australian officer was hit by Japanese gunfire. Butch Bissett and his brother Stan were among the many brave leaders of men on those mountains. Butch now lay bleeding on the side of the track.
Doc gave him an injection of morphine and had a good look at him, and he got a burst of machine gun fire through his tummy.
I saw Stan and Butch together with the doctor. I said, "How are things, Stan?" He said, "Oh, Butch is dying." I moved on. But I saw that Stan was visibly upset, as he has been and as or ever will be.
We just talked. He was unconscious at times, and other times he was good. You know, he knew I was there, and we held each other's hand, and we talked, quite a few about things from their mum and dad and their great days. At 4 o'clock he died, and from that time onwards we just had to carry on then with the day.
Nobody went to that war or any other, I suppose, that didn't get wounded mentally, if not physically. It wasn't possible.
All through the night, a stumbling procession moves back in dribs and drabs along the track. They put one stretcher down by the track for a moment to give the fellow a rest from the jolting. He's got a bedraggled, half-damp fag in his mouth, and he asks for a match. We give him a light, roll another cigarette for him, and he says, "Thanks, mate. The smoke helps a lot. I'll be okay now." They lift him gently, but he winces as the slow, agonising jolting begins again. You can drive men like this back, but you can't conquer them. Nothing tests troops as much as a withdrawal, and they're standing this test. But neither they nor you want any more talk about glorious withdrawals.
Our initial objective of trying to capture Kokoda was impossible with the forces that were against us and what we had. Our main objective then was to try and defend the track and keep ourselves between the Japanese and Port Moresby.
The Australian delaying tactics finally worked. They had conceded ground to the Japanese, but within sight of Port Moresby, the enemy supply lines were exhausted. The Japanese were forced to turn back. But there was little respect shown for the heroes of Kokoda and the blood they spilt on the trail. General MacArthur, ignorant of the conditions, criticised the performance of the Australian soldiers. Far more demoralising, their own commander, General Blamey, virtually accused them of cowardice. "Rabbits who run," he said, "get shot."
We thought he'd come up to praise us, and we were all up there at our finery on Brigade Parade, doing our best to look good, and we were good. And this tirade started. You'd be beat by inferior troops. And he got onto the rabbits that run better. I felt that there was something going on behind me. I was out in front. There were murmurings. I thought, good God, what's happening? There was never a physical movement of the troops, but it wouldn't have taken much to spark them. They were incensed.
Australia's war cameraman, Damien Pera, was determined to set the record straight. He dispatched his footage of the Kokoda campaign back to Australia.
saw militiamen fighting over there, fighting under extremely difficult conditions, and alongside the AIF, and they acquitted themselves magnificently. Some of the finest and toughest troops in the world. Troops with a spirit amongst them that makes you intensely proud to be an Australian.
Australian forces were also fighting with spirit on the other side of the world. By October 1942, one division of our troops was still in the Middle East. Tobruk had fallen to Rommel, and his desert army had advanced towards El Alamein and Cairo. The same Australians who defied the Germans at Tobruk were now back into action with the British Army. They lived up to their fierce reputation in a series of battles. This led to one of the great artillery barrages of the war, near El Alamein.
It was dark, and it was absolutely still. We could hear the counting down, 10, 9, 8, 7, 3, 2, 1.
Oh, it's just like hell let loose, as I say. You just keep walking ahead. Just keep walking and hope you survive.
I was overhead before daylight that morning, and the whole area was alight with gunfire from both sides. And I was very thankful that I was up above, looking down, not down amongst it. And you'd wonder how anyone could have possibly lived through it. It was fantastic. It was a sea of flame underneath.
In the mayhem of the following days, the Australians broke into Rommel's defences. Deliberately drawing the might of the Germans, they sustained heavy casualties.
One guy fired at me from a dugout, and I had a tin hat on, and it actually went under my hat, through my hair, and out the back of the hat. And all I did was chuck a hand grenade in there. So I don't know how many were in there, but I never looked back, so I didn't have to.
After a week of bitter and costly fighting, the Germans were finally worn down by the Allies. Rommel had no alternative but to withdraw. 620 Australians had been killed.
When it was over, you could have just about called it a draw. We had 44 blokes left in our battalion out of the 600 that had gone in about 8 days before. The Germans had not many more. They were walking round and surrendering, and at least we weren't surrendering, but they were. They'd had enough.
It was one of Australia's great military achievements. Honoured for their bravery, these troops would now also turn for home. But the RAAF fighter and bomber squadrons stayed on. Day after day, they chased the Germans and Italians back across North Africa, gambling their lives in the madness and chaos of dogfights.
You see enemy aeroplanes coming in, or they're about to approach them. You tense up a lot, and you got a certain amount of, I suppose, fear. To be honest, I used to get damn frightened. But then when things would happen, you get past being frightened and you become automatic.
Bobby Gibbs downed one Italian fighter in the Libyan desert. Later, he found the crashed aircraft.
There was quite a lot of blood in the cockpit, but there was no one buried near it, so obviously I'd damaged the pilot quite badly. I took the joystick out. I don't think I ever bothered cleaning it, and it's pretty gory.
The Italian pilot he shot down was Captain Giorgio Savoia. He died 3 months later and was posthumously decorated for his bravery in combat. After the war, Bobby Gibbs was invited to Italy. He presented the joystick to Giorgio Savoia's Air Force colleagues.
I felt pretty uneasy. I thought, well, these people should hate me because I've killed their very famous man. And but instead of that, they started cheering me. Oh, I'm stupid, but it affected me terribly. But war's a funny thing. People can be so bloody forgiving, and so I was terribly upset about it, and still am when I think about it. Normally you don't think about someone you've killed. Normally, when you shoot someone down, it's the aeroplane you shot down.
Waging war from the air can be random and indiscriminate. But for the British, it became their best option in the war against Germany. Driven out of Europe in 1940, Britain resorted to long-range bombing of German cities. It was debatable which was more dangerous, being under the bombs or dropping them.
People have likened it to the charge of the Light Brigade, except the charge of the Light Brigade only had to do it once.
It was more dangerous to fly in these bombing raids than it was to fight in the trenches of the First World War. Thousands of young Australians had volunteered for the Empire Air Training Scheme and came to Britain to fly against the Germans.
I wanted to be a fighter pilot. I'd heard stories about the Battle of Britain before I went, and I thought, well, that'll be for me. I wasn't a very brave sort of a chap, and I thought, well, if it gets too hot, I can get up into a cloud and fly around for a while and then come back.
In the early years of the war, German bombing tore the heart out of Britain's industrial cities, killing thousands of civilians. Churchill promised revenge. The bomber offensive was born. Two young Australian brothers climbed into a Lancaster for their first mission.
I can remember feeling so dry in the mouth and things and wonder what it's going to be all about. As we go over the English Channel with all these planes around, it was rather awe-inspiring. And we run up to the target and we looked out, and I've never seen so much flak, and I thought, how the hell will we ever get through that?
You've got to experience it to believe it. You've never could have experienced so much destruction in such a short time.
Once you get back to the squadron, you're going for intelligence.
I hear you made a nice landing. I hope we haven't kept you waiting, sir. Good Lord, no. Come and sit down.
And the intelligence officer said to us,
well, how'd you get on?
what was the flak like?
Well, we did
and the rear gunner said, bloody heavy. And I said, yeah, thick as hell.
And Group Captain Edwards said, light to moderate, in a very classical voice. And the rear gunner turned to me and said, if that's light to moderate, God help us if that's ever heavy, you know?
Each crewman was expected to complete 30 bombing operations, but only 1 in 3 would make it to the end.
In 1 month, I lost a third of the squadron. In one night, almost in just 14 aircraft to Berlin, I lost 4. To lose people was hard to take. I could take everything but that.
Right, well, you all know the target. It's Berlin, once more.
The technology was crude, and the vast majority of bombs did not hit their designated military or industrial targets.
The first couple of times I did it, I surprised myself. I actually found myself praying. I never thought I'd do that. But after about 3 times, I realised the people on the ground would be praying to the same deity as I was, and they might be praying harder, so I gave up.
Later, the targets were shifted to the centres of German cities. The bombing crews did not see the results of their raids.
I never worried about the Germans we killed because it was either them or us, especially in the air. But I did used to think about maybe ones we'd wounded or kids and things like that. Yeah, it did me no good. Got to me in such a stage, I went up to see the Padre, and I said I'd had enough, and I didn't want to let the crew know that I was feeling that way. But the Padre just had to talk to me, and he said, you know, Eric, he says, you've got to go and do it. He said, but treat each day as though it's going to be your last, he says, and enjoy it.
The bombing of cities brought terror to civilians on all sides of the war. The human costs were terrible, and 3,500 Australians from Bomber Command would never return home. In Papua, by the end of 1942, the Japanese had been forced to a standstill. But there was still much desperate fighting to be done. More Australian reinforcements arrived in Port Moresby, along with the belligerent General MacArthur. Unimpressed by the achievements of Australian soldiers, he bluntly demanded they redouble their attacks, at whatever cost.
This is Colonel Cullen, sir, said blame me to MacArthur. How do you do, Cullen? Very well, sir, thank you. And he pointed like that. He said, Cullen, the eyes of the Western world are on you. Go.
Responding to their orders, the Australians pushed the Japanese back across the Owen Stanleys to the coast. After 2 months of vicious fighting, the Japanese beachheads fell. But the Australians paid a high price in casualties for MacArthur's impatience. And they'd come to hate the Japanese.
We'd take every opportunity to do the damage. It wasn't a game anymore. There were rumours of cannibalism, rumours of ill treatment of prisoners, rumours. That added up to a complete hatred. Experienced campaigners told us that the Germans were gentlemen compared with these people.
Stories of Japanese atrocities circulated among the troops. But it was the prisoners of war who felt the full force of their brutality. 22,000 Australians were now imprisoned by the Japanese and used as slave labour. They toiled on projects like the notorious Burma-Thailand Railway in conditions of savagery.
We were just living in rags. Virtually it came down to a G-string and not even boots. I was about 150 days without boots. Then there were all the diseases, and then on top of that was the hard work and ill treatment we were getting and the long hours we were working.
There was a lot of people who died through no desire to go on. I mean, the conditions were pretty hard. Life was pretty tough. You'd go to work at 7 or 8 in the morning, and some mornings you'd come back at 3 the next morning. You'd work right through the day and then into the night. They'd have bamboo lights, piles with lights on them to keep you going.
These camps and their horrors produced their own heroic stories. Small triumphs of the human spirit, of survival, character and mateship.
I couldn't have got a stronger contrast between civilization and nature than I got up there. I got the worst of mankind coming out on the one hand and the best of nature coming out on the other.
Ray Parkin survived by turning his mind off the horror and painting the natural world of the jungle with paints he'd smuggled into the camp.
All the blokes around me were collecting butterflies and insects. You got this, if you got that, of course I didn't have time to paint it all. So what we did, we pinned these things on the ceiling, and we had a ceiling covered with these beautiful butterflies and everything. And I thought, well, this is better than the Sistine Chapel ever could be.
Men were weakened by starvation, sadism and chronic disease. But in the depths of despair, the Australian prisoners stuck together, always looking out for each other, even in death.
No one died alone. I used to do death watches when I was in hospital there at one stage. I had dysentery for 7 months, and I used to do death watches. And they just didn't die alone.
In camps from Changi to Sandakan, the death count climbed relentlessly. 1/3 of the Australian prisoners held by the Japanese would die.
The recent revelations of unspeakable horrors suffered by Allied prisoners of war at the hands of the Japanese have sharpened the agonies of anxiety for thousands of Australian relatives. Sympathy goes out to all those mothers, wives, and sweethearts whose long vigil is now darkened by new fears. In their name, all Australia is dedicated anew to the gigantic task of bringing about the extermination of an enemy that befouls the earth.
There was a hatred, if you like, say morale-boosting hatred, that we just got to beat these Japs. And no prisoners were taken, and if they were usually killed afterwards.
There was no mercy given, like as far as killing anyone. What had to be done was done.
On one occasion, the leading platoon captured, I think, 5 or 7 Japanese, tied them up and moved on to get on with the battle. And the next platoon came long bayoneted those Japs. And you might say that's nothing compared with what the Japs did to our prisoners of war and so forth, but for that reason I refused to give evidence at the war crimes trial. I felt in a way it was my battalion, my soldiers, and I felt pretty guilty about that. But it's very understandable. I'm not really critical of the soldiers. They were full of determination and hate.
Australia had become virtually self-reliant by 1943. The threat of invasion had receded, and the civilian population was fully mobilized behind the war effort. But the fighting in New Guinea continued, every bit as harsh and brutal as Kokoda. The Americans controlled the sea and air, and General Blamey now had a more potent force at his disposal. Many of these men had fought from the beginning in the Middle East. They proved themselves once again at Wau and Salamaua and near Lae, where the veterans of El Alamein came ashore.
I had this thought that this war was going to go on for years, and if you're going to be in it, you're going to get killed eventually. Because every time we go into action, we'd lose 4 or 5 of our blokes, you know. And you've got to be, you can't miss out all the time. You've got to eventually be the one that gets it, you know.
The Australians fought on mountain ridges that could barely be climbed. At Saddleberg and Shaggy Ridge, the Japanese were rolled back. The art of jungle warfare had been mastered, and as a fighting force, this was our finest hour. Our men were often landed by Australian ships, and the planes that strafed and bombed the enemy were now made in Australia. In the decisive battle of the Bismarck Sea, our bow fighters led the low-level attacks on the Japanese troop convoy. But the price continued to be high. In Papua and New Guinea, more than 5,500 Australians were killed. 7,000 more lay wounded.
I don't think I ever heard a patient ask for what is now called painkillers. One had to use one's own discretion and powers of observation to know whether a man was in pain or not. But they never complained. There were no yells from them. They were marvellous, really marvellous men. I have nothing but admiration for them. Some of them looked upon you as a big sister. Their big sister. And I know one was asking for his mother, you know, and I just sort of tried to comfort him by saying I was, so that satisfied him. It was before he died.
Australians had fought selflessly in defence of their homeland. But the war was to end in anticlimax. The final year saw Australia increasingly marginalised. Our soldiers and airmen were left behind as MacArthur pushed north. But some Australian ships went with the Americans. From the outbreak of the war, the Royal Australian Navy had served in every theatre of operations, taking part in almost every major naval battle. But But as they sailed with MacArthur, the Japanese had one last surprise.
What hurt most was the most important people of the ship were killed. You just wonder just how you're going to handle things from there on.
The kamikaze was a disturbing new Japanese weapon. The captain and 29 crew on HMAS Australia were killed, the first of 6 attacks on the ship. The Japanese suicide pilots killed 5,000 Allied sailors before the end of the war. MacArthur pushed on towards victory, refusing to allow others to share in the glory. But the Australians continued to die in fiercely fought battles against isolated Japanese bases. These campaigns had no strategic influence on the outcome of the war. We simply proved we were good allies, and the men fought on as ever. But many found it hard to believe that their fighting and dying still mattered.
That last campaign we did, nearly a complete washout. And they used up a lot of lives and got nothing. That hurt our fellas a lot.
The Japanese refused to submit until in August 1945, the Americans played their final card. A month after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese formally surrendered. A week later, the Japanese Second Army surrendered to General Blamey at Morotai. This final ritual was played out on the island base from where the Australians had launched their last attacks, witnessed by the men who'd fought this enemy to the bitter end, and the nurses who'd picked up the pieces.
The Japanese were marched in by 4 of the tallest Australians that could be found. And they stood there at attention. And then in came Sir Thomas Blamey with General so-and-so. And Sir Thomas Blamey read out the peace terms. Well, he wasn't a tall man, but he was rotund. And the more he read, the more scarlet he became in the face. And he blew himself up and yelled these terms at these Japs. Oh, they couldn't do anything else but sign, could they? Put their swords on the table. Sign. And that was it. But I really thought Sir Thomas Blamey would have a stroke if he didn't get away from there. See?
So this was how it all ended. The first war in which we faced a struggle for our national survival. Almost 1 million Australians had served in the Second World War. 1 in 7 people. And the land they held dear was now safe.
Train pulled in at Spencer Street. Pat was there waiting to meet me. And there was that. I can't do it. The rest, it's too emotional.
Oh, he was very much not the fun boy that he was when he went away.
And there, you know, she had a little small car there in a basket. It was my son.
We pulled into Sydney Harbour and
I got 2 letters. The first one was from my fiancée, who told me that she'd shot off with another bloke. And the other one was from my mother, to say my brother had been killed in the Air Force.
Some people were streaming in and out of the house and congratulating me on being home and all that. And the local butcher came up to me, you know. He didn't want to know what I had to tell him. He was telling me. He said, while you were away, you've no idea what it was like here. He said, even tea was rationed. I said, God, I'm glad I wasn't here.
I think I went away probably as a self-satisfied young man. The experience I had as a POW did me the world of good. I came home a much better man than I went away.
It's not easy, is it? Not easy to forgive and forget. I know one should forgive, maybe not forget, but to do both is difficult.
We're stubborn people. A bit bloody mad sometimes. I'm proud to be one of them. Happy they let me join.